Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our retirement webinar series. I'm Nick Brummer, and joining me today is my fellow director, Stuart Dyer. Very important subject we're talking about today. In our first part, do I have enough to retire? We're based here in Newlands, Cape Town, from our offices. Just a little bit about Investonline. As you can see, a picture of our team there. We're a team of 15. I'm a chartered accountant. We've got a whole lot of certified financial planners, and we're independent financial advisors. We do financial planning and investment advice. Investonline's been around for 16 years. Stuart, he's been with us for over 10 years, and we have a highly qualified team of financial planners. Thank you for joining us today. This is a really important subject. And Stuart, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Nick. And thanks to everyone for joining today. We're going to have the same format that we did for our offshore wrappers webinar. And I'm going to talk for roughly, I would expect about 20 minutes. I'm just going to cover the agenda we see on screen right now. We're going to go through 5 common mistakes retirees make, assessing financial readiness, whether to preserve your funds or retire from them. Something we see quite commonly that individuals aren't sure which option is right for them. We're going to talk about inflation and the long-term impact of inflation, and then choosing between living annuities and life annuities. Obviously a really key decision one makes when you retire from your fund. And we're going to go through some framework around that. And then we've got some questions that have been submitted. Nick will go through some questions with me. I think there was maybe 40 or 50 questions submitted just for this webinar today. And we've selected 9 questions that we'll answer for you. So just around the 5 mistakes we see retirees make. Number 1, I think obvious one is drawing too much income too early. Obviously, how much you can spend when you retire is a function of what age you retire. So, some individuals do retire later in their 60s or even into their 70s. Then because you don't have as long that you need your money to last, you are able to start with withdrawing a little bit more when you retire. But often, quite a lot of people are retiring younger these days, as young as 55 to 60. And then you've really got to plan for your money to last 30 to 35 years or even longer. And I think one issue is just to ensure that you don't start by drawing too much and putting too much pressure on your capital early in retirement. And being conservative, being too conservative, I think another temptation when one retires is to have an over-reliance on cash or cash-like investments similar to fixed deposits. While guaranteed interest rates sounds attractive, we know that once you factor in tax, you factor in inflation, often you're not doing yourself the best service by having an over-reliance on conservative assets such as cash or fixed deposits. So it is important to have a diversified investment that beats inflation after tax over time. Number 3 is not planning for irregular or unforeseen expenses. We're going to talk quite a lot about planning for income and planning for what we call capital goals. Capital goals is all your larger lump sum amounts that you potentially will still need to pay for after you retire. So we're going to go through that, and it's very important to plan for that because you've got to make sure you've got enough liquid capital to fund those goals. Focusing on products instead of strategy. I think especially when those products, we're talking about underlying investment products like funds and ETFs, when there's too much of a focus on investment performance and chasing the best ETF or the best fund, Often the structuring of your retirement, things, issues such as tax planning and estate planning can be overlooked. So we do feel that you have to plan everything holistically and make sure you consider all aspects. And neglecting tax efficiency. Once again, I think you just need to make sure you're using the right type of investment accounts and drawing your income in the correct way to make sure you're as tax efficient as possible. So just into the meat of the presentation, assessing readiness. So in the Do I Have Enough to Retire topic, we're going to give a bit of a step-by-step guide of how we work through it with our clients and our new clients that we deal with. I think the first thing is you need to build a budget for yourself. So you can always start if you don't have a budget already. We've got a good Excel template that you can use where you can capture all of your expenses. But ultimately, you would have a budget with your different categories of expenses, similar to one on the screen here. And then you need to apply some mind to it, apply some thought to it, sit with your spouse, or if you sit by yourself and think, what could your budget look like when you were to retire? So some expenses may go up, especially entertainment and travel. If you're early in retirement, you potentially want to do a lot more enjoyable activities, and some line items will fall away. So some line items we see fall away if you're going to cancel your life cover when you retire. Often one could consider cancelling life cover, because either the life cover was linked to your employer fund and now your life cover automatically stops, or if you're funding your own life cover, you have to ask yourself if you still need that life cover, because if you've got no liabilities, you've built up your wealth now when you retired, you potentially don't need that life cover, and that life cover can become unaffordable when you retire. And then other things that would normally fall away would be your investment contributions and your pension fund contributions, because you're no longer saving for retirement, you're now living off of your capital. So then you get your new budget and what we call your new expenses. And we think of this as your basic living expenses. This doesn't include travel, doesn't include your other what we call big ticket items. Now, secondly, you need to plan what are those larger expenses, whether that's recurring or variable throughout the rest of your life, that you may still need to pay for. I think one that we see almost everyone doesn't think about is replacing your vehicles and purchasing more vehicles during your lifetime. Some obvious ones would be overseas travel, if you do like to travel. And then things like your home maintenance, family support. If you've got any children's weddings you still need to pay for. If you've got any bucket list goals you want to think about and prepare and model to see if you can afford to do these goals in your lifetime. And if you've got any charitable contributions that you want to make. So often we do it with clients is that they would write down all of their potential goals that they would want to fund, and we would go and model that for them to see how much accessible money they need to fund those goals. So you can see we obviously escalate those goals with inflation going forward, and we try and plan how frequently would you want to do some of those goals. If you wanted to travel overseas, would you do it annually? Would you do it every 3 years? If it's a once-off event, we would plan for what age would you potentially do that event, and we capture all of that very accurately for you. Now, this is just an example of, I always think it's nice to look at your goals and your spending with inflation going forward. It can be really eye-opening when you see if you want to buy a 500,000 Rand car, that same car in 15 years will cost you over R1 million. So this is an example of the sort of chart we would give you to show you all your goals increasing with inflation going forward. And the same thing for your income and expenses. So often what your income would be your income that coming from formal sources of income. If you've still got any employment income, or ordinarily it would now be your pension income, such as a living annuity. And then you would have your expenses, which would include tax. And your expenses can be more than your actual income you're getting from your pension. And that difference between the income you're getting and the expenses you're spending has got to be funded from other savings, such as unit trust savings, money market savings. And then eventually with your pension, if you've taken out a living annuity, your living annuity is going to reach the 17.5% income cap at some point, at which point your income is going to start depleting. So this is something you want to plan for ahead of time and make sure you've got the right liquidity in your plan. So liquidity is something you'll hear us talk about a lot. And this is an example of what one calls a whale graph, showing you how long your capital will last. And that big red area, that is where you've still got capital, but you don't have access to enough money to fund the goals that you've selected. So the goals being your income that you need for your expenses, as well as the capital goals that you would have outlined. So that red area is where now you don't have enough liquid money. And that's something that can be prevented if planned for. So this chart just shows you the difference between what's called your liquid investment assets in the light blue versus the dark blue, which is your non-liquid assets, which is ultimately your living annuity or your pension. So when your liquid assets are depleted, now you don't have any capital that's left. You've just got your pension. You can continue to draw income, but if you need to pay for anything larger, you're going to ultimately have to start drawing your maximum income you can to start saving for things on the side. You don't have any cash to tap into for medical expenses, holidays, or whatever it may be. So I think a key aspect or a key area that must be looked at very carefully when you retire from your fund is to consider your lump sum carefully. I know a lot of people know you can take your 550,000 Rand tax-free in your lifetime. And 9 times out of 10, when we're meeting with new clients, they say, oh, I'm just going to take my 550. They're maybe not too sure what they've taken in the past, and they're not considering their liquidity for their plan going forward. So first thing you need to do is you need to look at your lump sum carefully, because that can solve a lot of problems of creating more liquid money in your plan if you need it. So first thing you can do is check your excess contributions. If you've had a provident fund in the past where you weren't able to claim the contributions for tax deductions, that will all be sitting as excess contributions in your name. If you've made contributions to a retirement fund or an RA over and above what you're allowed to claim on an annual basis, that will also be captured as excess contributions. So it's very easy to check your excess contributions. We just need your ID number and your tax number. That's something we can do for individuals. It doesn't, there's no charge to it. And then it's to assess your tax implications. If you had to take more than the 550,000, I know I've spoken quite a bit that it can make sense to pay tax, to take more out of your fund as cash if the scenario sees fit. Because ultimately you're going to pay tax to get the money out of your living annuity if you take it as income. So sometimes it can make sense to take a larger lump sum up front and give yourself more liquid capital that you can put aside either locally or offshore to use in your retirement plan. So what you really want to do is you want to create more liquidity for your plan. And this is just an example of the same plan. If we tweaked a few things, potentially drew more from the living annuity up front, took a slightly higher lump sum, and changed a few elements, it's the same plan. You can see the money's lasting longer, and you push out that liquidity issue that you had in the first chart. So these are real charts that have been generated by our model we go through with clients. So we're happy to run through this model with anybody who is looking for a retirement assessment to be done. And then the question now, let's say you've retired from your corporate job, where you've got retirement annuity that you're thinking of retiring from. I know a lot of people ask us, should I keep the fund as an RA or as a pension fund and defer it or put it to a preservation fund, or should I convert it to a living annuity? They're looking for some sort of thought process to go through on how to decide. I think the key thing is to understand these few issues around the differences. So the one thing is that when you When you're preserving, you're keeping your money in a pre-retirement product, which is either an RA, a pension fund, a provident fund, or a preservation fund. If you retire, you can take your money to a living annuity or a life annuity. Now, if you keep it in the preserved state, you don't have access to income. These days, with the two-pot system, you can take some money out of your fund that's in your savings pot. However, it is taxable. But ultimately, the savings pot shouldn't be too large for anybody yet because the savings pot hasn't been around for too long. When you retire, if you move your money to a living annuity, you can have access to income. You can draw money either monthly, quarterly, or annually from your living annuity fund. If you're in a pre-retirement fund and you're preserving, now you're still restricted to Regulation 28 rules. So Regulation 28 rules, for instance, you can only have up to 75% in the stock market, and the big one is you can only have up to 45% offshore. So I know that's quite a restriction that not everybody's too fond of. Whereas with the living annuity, I hope everyone's aware, you can have up to 100% offshore. You can have offshore funds, offshore shares. It just, obviously a living annuity is a RAND product, but you can invest 100% offshore in it, which gives a lot of flexibility. Your beneficiary treatment, if you're in a pre-retirement fund, such as an RA or pension fund, this is a really key area on the slide, is the beneficiary treatment is vastly different. If you pass away with a pension fund or an RA or preservation fund or any of these retirement funds, the trustees of the fund are ultimately in control of who gets the money. You can have a beneficiary nomination, which serves as a guiding note to the trustees of who you would like to get the money, but the trustees have a duty to assess who your beneficiaries are, to assess who your dependents are. And they go through a whole process of trying to establish your entire family tree, essentially, if you're married, who your siblings are, who your children are. They go through a process of contacting your family members to see if anyone has a claim to the fund outside of your beneficiary you've nominated. They go as far to ask for bank statements, proof of residences to prove dependency. So it's a very admin-intensive process, and that process takes up to 12 months before the trustees have to make a determination on who gets the money in the fund. With a living annuity, none of that applies. There's no trustee discretion. Whoever you write as your beneficiary will be your beneficiary. If your beneficiaries passed away before you pass away, then your estate just gets the money. And ultimately, that process can take around 1 month for the beneficiary to get the money. So it's a lot simpler to wind up a living annuity than it is to wind up an RA or a pension fund. And just around, if you're approaching retirement and thinking about all these different issues, living annuity versus life annuity, what inflation rate to use going forward, it's really important to be aware of how variable inflation can be in an emerging market country like South Africa, and to plan accordingly. I think when Nick and myself and the team are in front of clients, going through all the robust thinking around their plans, what inflation rates to use on medical aid, what inflation rates to use on your normal expenses like groceries, what products to use. It's important to think, you're not thinking just about the next 10 years, particularly if you are retiring, around the normal age, around 60 to 65. You're still thinking for 25 years plus. And I think you've got to go through all sorts of economic scenarios that could play out in the country and make sure that you'll be okay in most of those scenarios. And that's where we like to highlight inflation in a lot of our discussions. And I know a lot of people in South Africa do use 5% and are going with 2 life annuities where they're justifying to go into a life annuity so they can get more income up front, but then they're taking a 5% fixed escalation on their income. The reality is 5% sounds fine given where inflation is in the country at the moment, But there are periods, and there have been periods in the country where 5% would have left you well behind inflation. So I've just got this line here, this red line, which is around the 5% mark. And you can see all the years over the last 55 years in South Africa where inflation was above 5%. So if you ultimately in a place where your inflation on your lifestyle that you live, the shops you shop at, where you buy your groceries, is above the government inflation that they print in CPI, your expenses can go up quite a lot faster than what government CPI is saying that inflation is. And just to illustrate the compounding effect of this over 35 years, if your inflation is just 2% higher than average government CPI, that ends up that your expenses can almost be more than double what they would have been if you had to have that 2% extra compounded over the long term. So it's really important to plan for this, because ultimately you don't want to be in a position where you're forced to reduce your lifestyle because you haven't planned for inflation correctly. And often quite a few decisions you make when you retire can't be reversed, such as the decision to go into a life annuity, which we'll talk about now. So just final section, and then we'll go into the Q&A. A living versus life annuity. Living annuity is a market-linked investment, so you get to choose what it actually invests in. Whereas a life annuity or guaranteed annuity, I know the terminologies can be confusing, but ultimately think of it as a guaranteed annuity. That is an insurance contract where you get income for the rest of your life. In the living annuity, your capital remains invested. Your capital goes from your pension fund or RA, and it remains invested in the living annuity. With the life annuity, your capital falls away. And the way to think about it is that you're giving your money away to the insurance company in exchange for lifetime income. Now, with the living annuity, you can choose how much you withdraw from it. So yes, you can run out of money, but you have control of that depending on how much you withdraw. Whereas with the life annuity, the income is quoted when you set the life annuity up. So you may be aware that the life annuity rates change every week. They can go up and down quite drastically, and often what they do is they follow bond rates in South Africa. So normally when the country's a little bit riskier and bond rates are a bit higher, life annuity rates will be higher, like they were 18 months ago. And when interest rates are a bit lower, the country's a little bit more steady, life annuity rates will reduce. So the key thing is that income is fixed at the start, and you can't change that income going forward. That contract is written based on the quote you accept when you set up the life annuity. And then from our perspective, you've got to think across these two options. It's not just about starting income. It's about what is your inflation protection for the rest of your life. And in our view, a living annuity can provide you quite a lot more protection against high or hyperinflation environment, because you can put your money offshore, which can protect if the rand had to weaken quite quickly. And also the fact that you can change your income quite variably from year to year to keep up with high inflation if inflation is high, or low inflation if there's a low inflation environment. It gives you flexibility about how much you draw and when. Whereas with the life annuity, you stating upfront what your escalations will be going forward. And I've just got a few examples. You could have a level income, which we would never recommend, where your income never increases. You can have a fixed annual increase, and standard is 5%, which, as I've mentioned, we feel is too low. Or you can link your income to CPI, but I know a lot of people would feel that their personal inflation is higher than what the government printed CPI is. At the moment, CPI is printed at around low 3%, which I know a lot of people would feel isn't too accurate for them. And then the beneficiary treatment, if you've got a living annuity, that capital can still pass to a beneficiary. If you've got a life annuity, the payments stop. Payments either stop on the death if you've got a single annuity on the death of the first annuitant, or if you do have a joint annuity with your husband or wife, it stops on the death of the last surviving spouse. So that's just a bit of a framework around the difference between the two products. Really important to understand that you can, let's say you're retiring now from your corporate job at 60, I move my money to a living annuity, you can move it to a life annuity at another stage. That money can then be sold out of the living annuity and converted to a life annuity later in life. But once your money has gone to a life annuity, you can't undo that. It's an insurance product, and that capital is generally can't be reversed back to a living annuity down the line. And just to go through a few charts around, the topic of do I have enough to retire and starting income. This is an example of a living annuity of 10 million Rand. And this is someone who's starting at age 60 by drawing 7% of their money per year. So as you may know, it's recommended to draw 4% or so if you want your money to last 30 years or longer. So this person starting at 7% drawdown is essentially starting with too high a drawdown given how long they still potentially have to live. So you can see it takes about 15 years until the capital hits that liquidity issue and your income ultimately starts to reduce. So you've still got money, you've just not able to draw enough money on a monthly basis as you would like. So we had to do the same individual, 10 million Rand living annuity. Look how vastly different this picture is. Who starts with the recommended 5% drawdown. You can see how that liquidity is completely fine. This plan lasts the person until over the age of 90. And only at that stage would the income start to reduce. Good. So that's just a bit of the information around the key content, Nick. And now we can go through some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Well done. I got through a lot of content there. Thank you to everybody for submitting questions. As Stuart said, there were like 40 to 50 questions. Really appreciate those. We've selected 9, and I'm going to put them to Stuart. I might take 1 or 2. First one is, what is the best way to structure your retirement funds?
Oh, good. In structuring one's retirement funds is something that we would have to advise on quite a case-by-case basis. It really depends on what your investment assets look like as of right now. I think short answer is that you want to have the right drawing of income between your retirement money and your other money. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to plan how much you're going to spend monthly versus how much you're going to spend on a capital basis. And we've got the second webinar in this series tomorrow that we're going to do on how to create a retirement plan, where we'll talk through this in quite a lot more detail. So I think if you want the long answer, then we can go through that tomorrow.
Okay, all right. Regulation 28, how does that limit and promote outcomes?
Yeah, so Regulation 28, obviously the key things are the restrictions of what you're allowed to invest in. So far, it hasn't been too restrictive. Obviously, with the South African stock market, did lag offshore markets for some time. So during that time, you could only take 30% offshore. So that way it was slightly restricted for a period of time. But now you can take up to 45% offshore, which I know the fund managers are a lot more comfortable with that. So I think the key thing is that if the SA market did lag and SA funds did lag offshore materially over the longer term, then you would want to not be in Regulation 28 products because your performance would be worse. Outside of that, I think those are the key differences between what the restrictions are.
Right. Are there any tax implications or charges that I would incur if I move my funds from my current provider to another institution?
So in short, there shouldn't be charges, and there are no tax implications if you've got a RA preservation fund or a living annuity. you are allowed to move from one retirement insurance company, essentially, or fund platform, to another fund platform. Some of the older insurance products, if your RA is 10 years plus old, then some of them may have, penalties that may need to be looked in. But ordinarily, any living annuities these days, you can move from one provider to another. There shouldn't be a charge to do that, and there shouldn't be any tax. There aren't any tax implications to do that. So that's a process we do very regularly.
Section 10C. Right, there's a lot about this around. Will you pay state duty on Section 10C, i.e. excess contributions?
Yeah, good. I know we only touched on Section 10C and excess contributions very briefly today. Tomorrow in the structuring a retirement plan topic, we're going to talk about 10C quite extensively. To answer you, there is a situation where state duty can be avoided by using Section 10C, and there are other situations where assets can still be estate dutiable. So when you put cash into a retirement fund that's over and above what you can claim as a tax deduction, that money is called an excess contribution. So it's money over and above what you've claimed as a tax deduction in that year. And SARS keeps a record of that. Now, when you get to retirement, you can either take that out as a tax-free lump sum, or you can roll that over into your pension. Whatever rolls over into your pension gives you relief on your tax on your pension income. Now, if you pass away now and you've still got excess contributions, and now your beneficiaries have the choice. They can either draw your money, take the money as a lump sum, or they can take the money as an annuity. If they take the money as a lump sum, estate duty still applies. So it's a little bit technical. There's a scenario where estate duty applies and the excess contributions will still be included as a deemed asset in your estate. If your beneficiaries take the money as an annuity in their own names, then there's no estate duty, because ultimately now the investment rolls over to their names and they pay tax on the income going forward. So there's case by case, the answer can differ depending on what the beneficiaries do with the money.
Right, yo. Okay, next one. When do you do away with life insurance, as it's costing us too much per month?
Yeah, I know I did touch on this a little bit earlier in the budgeting discussion. I think life insurance, often when you do get the other side of 60, 65, you see the premiums go up by as much as 10 to 15% per year. So your premium ultimately can double every 4 or 5 years, and it can just become unaffordable. I think let's talk about the scenarios where you would want to keep life insurance, and some of them are maybe not the nicest situations to be in, but if you do have liabilities that you don't have cash to cover, then you do need life insurance to pay those liabilities in your estate. If you're in ill health, then obviously maybe your life expectancy wouldn't be as long as the average life expectancy. Then it might make sense to still keep the life cover from a financial perspective. And then depending on children's situations, it's your estate duty that you might want to calculate. So there are some situations where you would want to keep life cover. But all in all, it does, in our thinking, it does make sense to start thinking about cutting your life cover or stopping your life cover at a certain point. Because ultimately when you do retire, now you've got your investment assets you've built up over your career, and it gets too expensive and you actually have to start drawing too much from your money to keep the life insurance going. It can also make it more tax heavy for you because you need to draw higher amounts of income to fund the life cover. So unless you meet one of those other scenarios I mentioned earlier of having debt, having particular kids you need to fund, or having a estate duty you need to fund, then it does make sense for us to consider cutting life insurance at some point.
Right, next one. I need more detail on lump sum withdrawals and their tax implications.
Sure. Okay. Well, ultimately, when you draw your lump sum, there's the different tax tables. There's a tax table on any withdrawals you make before you retire from a fund. That's called the withdrawal tax table. And then when you retire from a fund, which you can do any time past age 55, you have the retirement tax table. That's the one where you get 550,000 Rand tax free. And it's just important to go and do your tax simulations around the different amounts you can withdraw. So when you do tax simulations, it just calculates if you had to withdraw 500,000 Rand, what your tax would be, 1 million Rand, 2 million Rand, whatever it might be. And you can get very accurate illustration of what your tax would be on all those withdrawals. And it takes into account your past withdrawals as well. Just one last note on this. Just two things to remember. You're taxed on your lifetime withdrawals, not your withdrawal on that, not your withdrawal amount at that time only. So if you take 500,000 Rand now, that will be added to any withdrawals you've taken before, and the tax will be applied on the total. Also to bear in mind that severance benefits are also included in this. So if you've had a voluntary package where you've been paid severance, that's also included in the lump sum calculations. And that's why tax simulations are so important. If you have any more questions around this, please feel free to reach out. We'll happily answer it.
Right, okay. How risky is it in the current overheated JSE conditions to have a living annuity? Well, interesting question. I think maybe I should just unpack it a little bit in terms of the overheated JSE. So quite interesting, the JSE this year has really been driven by two asset classes. And those are effectively gold and precious metals, which is really gold and platinum. And then the other one is NASPAS. And NASPAS's main asset is Tencent in China, which has done very well. So that's really contributed about 40% of the JSE. So the interesting part about it is because they're so overweighted, any living annuity funds that are in unit trusts, generally those unit trusts wouldn't have much more than 20% combined in those two asset classes. I.e., so they'll probably be close to almost 50% underweight that, given how they've shot up over this year. So unpacking that further, just to give you some kind of feeling about the overheated JSE, which is really based on those two asset classes, I would estimate that equities in a living annuity would mainly probably comprise about 60% of a diversified portfolio. Let's call that a moderate risk portfolio. And of that 60%, probably 20% would be directly offshore, 40% would be local. So then 20% or 40% would be 8%. So you'd probably have about an 8% exposure to, let's call it, those two asset classes, which is the precious metals and NASPAS, which have gone up a lot. Saying that, the rest of the JSE offers very good value. And the recommendation would always be to have a diversified portfolio where you would have good exposure to those other areas in the JSE. So in short, a well-diversified living annuity, which is a moderate investment strategy, should not really have a overexposure, or there shouldn't be any real worry in a JSE condition which you may feel is overheated. Right, optimum stage or age to convert investments from a retirement annuity to a life annuity. No dependence.
Yeah, I think if you don't have dependents, then a life annuity is certainly something to consider instead of a living annuity if you're just an individual person. Remember, if you're an individual person, your rate that you get from a life annuity provider is higher than if you're a married couple. Because a married couple, they are needing to provide income for basically as long as two of you will live. And if you're just an individual, then they're just providing income for one person's life. So statistically, they can bank on a shorter time period for one person. So when the optimum stage or age is, I think, funnily enough, when just market-wise, as I mentioned earlier, because life annuity rates do follow bond rates quite closely, when the rand is a bit weaker, when bond rates are higher, that's when, from a quoted income perspective, life annuity rates are higher at those points in time. I mean, life annuity rates were off the charts high 18 months ago, pre-election, where I know there was lots of fear around what sort of government coalition could have looked like post the election. Right now, the rand has stabilized a lot. We know that the debt fears have been stabilized. Lots of life annuity rates have come down as a result of that. But just age-wise, the older you are, the higher the rate you get offered. It's as simple as them calculating how many years you statistically have to live. So Nick, you can remind me, but I think they're working on average age for males of early to mid-70s and for females late 70s. So if you're 70s years old, you're going to get a much higher rate than if you were at 58. So I know our view is that on that living annuity chart, if you're going to take out a living annuity, you can do so when you're 58, 60. You are fine. You know, ordinarily, you're not going to have your capital starting to come down in those first 10 years. So you can have the living annuity, you can have the flexibility of your drawing, have the flexibility of not giving your capital away. And then as you see that maybe you're starting to have to increase your income in the living annuity to unsustainable levels, at that stage, you could go to a life annuity. And at that stage, you would get a higher rate because you would be, instead of at 60, you do it 10 years down the line. Now you're 70 and you get a higher income. So that's generally been our thinking with clients, but there have been cases where we've recommended a life annuity straight away. It really depends on the individual case.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, just to chip in on that, I think very much SA landscape, given what Stuart just said about using about a 75 or early 70s life expectancy. So if you are, good health, you're mid 70s, you rely on income, then move into a life annuity, you'll get a much higher rate, and you'd really benefit if, let's just say, you're going to live for the next 15 years out of that. So that is something to consider, where you'll get a good deal, and it's something to really consider. Right, last question. What provision can be made for an adult child that is dependent because of illness?
Yeah, quite a question where there can be quite a range of answers. I'll just give some quick answers. So it really depends on how the money is invested at the moment. If the money is in a retirement fund, then normally the best way to do it is you could move your money to a living annuity, and you can nominate a trust to be the beneficiary of a living annuity. So if you do have an adult child that potentially you wouldn't want to give them the money directly, but you want to have the money that looks after them, then a trust that takes over the living annuity is the best way to do that. If the money is not in a retirement fund and it's just cash, then there's a lot of options, from opening a trust now while you're alive, or doing a testamentary trust, or you could put money into a retirement fund in the child's names, pay donations tax to do that. So there's a big range of answers. So whoever submitted this question, if you'd like a more accurate answer, please reach out to us. We're happy to go through that with you.
Right, good. Well done, Stuart. Well answered. Just want to go through just some of our core services. I think it's important that you know how we can assist you. So we do financial planning. I really recommend everybody just has a look at a financial plan. We'll do this for you, and we'll give you some really good visibility. With that, we also do investment management, and that investment management is important to ensure that you have the right investment strategy, and what also goes into that is that you have the right portfolio, active and passive management, and we balance that out for you as well. Direct offshore investing, absolutely key. Stuart will go through a little bit more about that, where that fits in terms of your retirement plan tomorrow. We've obviously gone through this in detail in some of our other webinars in our offshore wrapper, but absolutely direct offshore investing is key. And then the tax structuring. And I often say this is a no-brainer. The tax structuring can make a massive difference to the amount of income that you're going to get out in retirement. If you structure your investments in the right products. Remember, products are all taxed differently, and if you have the right asset classes in the right products, which are getting taxed slightly differently, you can have quite a tax saving and it makes it a lot more efficient. That's certainly what we'll do. Right, just maybe the last sales part, but our value add, it's always important that when selecting a financial advisor, you have somebody who's qualified, experienced, and also has a team. That's certainly what Investonline has. We work as a team of 15, experienced, plus 30 years of successful investing and risk management with a proven track record. You can go to our website and you can have a look at our performance. And separately, I run the Prosperity Fund, which is really the house view of our investments. Being transparent and cost effective is really important. So you can see every little cost, how we do it, how we put it together. That's absolutely key. The personalized service and administration. We're a team, so there's always somebody here to help you. Look for any new advice that you might need or reporting. And lastly, regular review meetings. So we have regular review meetings with our clients at least once a quarter, but it doesn't mean that we're only going to speak to you once a quarter. We're available all the time. So that's a really important part, is that you're never really forgotten about. We're here to assist you. So just how the process works, and often we get asked this, is we'll have an initial engagement with you so we can understand your needs and goals. Then we'll actually do the retirement assessment. We evaluate your retirement readiness. Thereafter, then we'll do a portfolio analysis. And this is an independent review of your investments, your fees, to actually see how you're structured. And then we'll go and we'll put this all together in a proposal. And that proposal will ensure that you're in the right products, the right tax efficiency, and with the right investment strategy. And obviously, we'll present that to you and make the necessary tweaks. Right, well, that's us. Thank you very much for joining us today. Hopefully you've found that really helpful. Part 2 is tomorrow. Please join us tomorrow. There's more detail. It goes a little bit more in depth, maybe a little bit more technical as well. But also just want to draw you to the website where we have all our other webinars on there. And I think they very well worth it to have a look at as well. But yeah, thank you for joining us and see you tomorrow. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.